At 3:47 in the morning, a hand closed around Lena Cortez's arm, hard enough to bruise the bone, and a voice behind her told her to move faster and used a word for her that she would still hear in her sleep a year later. She did not scream. She had learned a long time ago that screaming costs you the shift. 9 people sat inside that diner and heard every syllable of it through a propped back door, and not one of them stood up. Except a man in booth 6 with cold coffee he had not touched in 20 minutes, and a dog under the table that had not blinked once. If you believe people should stand up for each other, hit subscribe right now. Stay with me all the way to the end and drop the name of the city you are watching from in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. 6 hours before that hand found her arm, Lena Cortez was sitting in her car in the employee lot doing arithmetic she already knew the answer to. $61.40. 9 days until payday, 2 insulin pens left in the door of the refrigerator at home, and a 16-year-old boy who had been lying to her about how fast he was going through them. She had found out on Tuesday. She had counted the pens the way she counted everything out of habit, the way she counted the stairs to their apartment, and the tips in her apron, and the days on the calendar, and the number had been wrong in the direction that meant he was lasting longer than he should have been. A pen does not last longer because a boy is healthy. A pen lasts longer because a boy is taking less than he needs and telling his sister he feels fine. She had not confronted him. That was the thing she kept turning over. She had stood in the kitchen with the refrigerator door open and cold air on her face, and she had decided in about 4 seconds not to say anything, because if she said something out loud, then it became a fact. And if it became a fact, she would have to do something about it, and there was nothing to do about it that did not involve money she did not have. She had told herself she would fix it by Friday. It was Thursday. The car took 3 tries to start. It always did now. It only turned over reliably if she parked it facing downhill, which meant that every single day of her life, she had to think about geography before she thought about anything else. And there was something about that something small and grinding that had begun to feel like the whole shape of her existence. She parked facing the right direction. She counted the money. She fixed her face in the mirror, and she went inside to work a 12-hour shift and be pleasant to strangers. The Ocotillo diner sat off the highway attached to a truck stop, and it never closed. And Lena had worked the overnight there for 6 years because overnight paid a differential of 90 cents an hour, and because it meant she was home in the morning when Theo left for school and asleep by the time he got back, which meant he never had to watch her be tired. Bowie Ferris was already on the line when she clocked in. He was 58 years old, built like something you would need a permit to move, and he had done 6 years in Springer's for something he never discussed and never denied. He had exactly one rule, and he stated it to every new hire on their first night calmly like a man reading a weather report. He did not touch people. Not a hand on a shoulder, not a friendly shove, not a finger on a chest, no matter what anyone said to him or about him, because a man with his record who touched a customer did not get a lawyer, he got a sentencing hearing. He had built his entire personality around a cage he carried with him, and Lena had come to understand over 6 years that his stillness was not calm at all. It was containment. He looked at her once when she tied her apron and asked her what was wrong, and she said nothing was wrong, and he went back to the flat top, and that was the whole conversation, and both of them knew it was a lie and let it stand. Hollis Teague came in at 4 the way he always did. He was 76, and he pulled an oxygen tank behind him on a little cart, and he had driven long haul for 41 years before his lungs quit on him, and he still kept a CB radio in his truck that he still turned on every night for no reason he could explain to anyone. He ordered pie. He always ordered pie. He never finished it, and Lena never once mentioned that she boxed the rest, and he never once mentioned that he ate it in the parking lot. Nava Okonjo took the corner stool at 2. She was 68. She dispatched for a towing company that ran wreckers up and down that stretch of highway, and she did puzzles in pen and complained about them out loud to nobody in particular. Her company wrecker was parked out back most nights, and it had a dash cam on it that ran continuously because the owner had been burned by a fraudulent claim in 2019 and had gone slightly insane about documentation afterward. Neva mentioned this fact roughly twice a month as a joke, as an old woman's complaint about a boss who did not trust anybody, and nobody in that diner had any idea that they were listening to the single most important sentence any of them would hear that year. Kaylee Shore was 19 and 3 weeks into the job and still apologizing to customers for things that were not her fault. Lena had already started doing the thing she always did with new girls on overnight, which was quietly rearranging the schedule so that Kaylee never closed alone, never took the trash out alone, and never walked to her car without somebody watching from the window. She did not explain why she did it. Kaylee did not notice that it was happening. That was the point. Charlene Dowd ran the place, and Charlene had a voice she used for customers that sat about a full step higher than her real one. At 11 o'clock that night, Charlene pulled Lena into the office and told her in the real voice that corporate had flagged the location for complaints and that she needed everybody to be extra accommodating this month. And when Lena asked what that meant in practice, Charlene said it meant that Halloran Freight fueled 200 trucks a week at that stop, and that the lease on the building ran through a holding company with Vernon Halloran's name on the paperwork, and that Lena should let things go that she would not normally let go. Lena asked her to be specific. Charlene could not be specific, and that was somehow worse than a list would have been because it meant the instruction was not about any particular thing. It was about a category of thing. It was a request to lower a floor and leave it lowered. Lena went back out on the floor and refilled 4 coffees and felt something she did not have a word for yet, which was the sensation of being told in advance that whatever was coming, she would be expected to absorb it. The man came in at 20 past 11. She noticed him the way she noticed everybody, which was fast and without much interest, and then she noticed him a second time, which almost never happened. He was somewhere in his 40s. He carried himself like a man who had spent a long time in places where you did not sit with your back to a room. He took booth 6 without looking at the other booths, which meant he had already decided on booth 6 before he came through the door, which meant he had looked through the window first, which meant something, though she could not have said what. He had a dog with him. Lena started to tell him about the policy, and he had the card out on the table before she got the first sentence finished, laminated, worn soft at the corners, the way paper gets when it has been handled 1,000 times. Service animal. The dog went under the table and put her chin on her paws and did not look at a single person in the building. He ordered coffee, black nothing in it, and he did not touch the menu, and he did not make conversation, and Lena poured it and walked away and thought nothing else about him for 11 minutes. What she found out much later in a courtroom from a transcript was that Nathaniel Corrigan had not intended to stop in Vaughan Flats at all. I was 43 years old. He had spent 19 years in the Navy, and 11 of those in a community he did not name to civilians, and he was driving 1,400 miles from the California coast to a small town in Texas with a hard date attached to it because there was a memorial happening in 9 days for a man named Toby Grange. And Corrigan had promised Toby's widow that he would be there and that he would bring the dog. The dog was not his. The gun had been Toby's, and Corrigan had filed every piece of paperwork the Navy had to keep her from being washed out and put down after Toby died, and the entire purpose of the drive was to hand her over to an 11-year-old girl in Bandera who had been asking about her for a year. He had stopped for fuel, that was all. He had gotten out of the truck to stretch, and the dog had gotten out with him, and then the dog had sat down in the middle of that parking lot and refused to move. Corrigan had worked with her for 4 years. He knew the difference between a dog that is tired and a dog that is telling you something. She was not barking. She was not agitated. She had simply lowered herself onto the asphalt facing the far end of the lot where the trailers parked, and she had gone completely still, and she had not responded to her release word. So he had gone inside. He had ordered coffee he did not want and taken the booth that let him see the fuel islands through the window, and he had started counting things because that was what he did instead of sleeping. He counted 9 trailers. He counted the intervals of a box truck that pulled in at the far edge with its engine running and its rear plate obscured. He counted the fact that nobody got out of it and nobody fueled it, and it sat there for 40 minutes and left. That was the first Thursday he saw it. It was not the first Thursday it had happened. At midnight, Naiva Okonjo said something to Lena while working a puzzle, and she said it the way people say things that they do not think are important. She said that the little white box truck out there was going to give her a heart attack one of these nights because it came every Thursday and parked in the fire lane, and her boss would have towed it in 10 seconds if it were anybody else. But the boss would not touch anything with Halloran on the paperwork. Lena asked how long it had been coming. Neva said months. She said it like a woman describing a leaky faucet. Lena filed that away and did not know why. At 1:15, Kaylee came out of the walk-in cooler and told Lena that a man had talked to her in the parking lot 2 nights ago and offered her a job. Lena asked what kind of job. Kaylee said hostess work at a residence hall for seasonal workers about an hour out, and that it paid 18 an hour with room and board included, and that the man had been very polite and had not pushed at all, and had actually told her to think about it and not to rush, and had given her a phone number written on the back of a receipt. Lena asked her to describe him. Kaylee said he was young, maybe late 20s, clean, well-dressed for out here, and that he had asked about her family first before he asked anything else. He had asked whether her folks were local. He had asked whether anyone would miss her on weekends. Lena felt the hair come up on her arms and did not understand why, and she took the receipt out of Kaylee's apron pocket and put it in her own without explaining herself, and she told the girl to stay off the lot alone. And Kaylee laughed and said okay in the way that 19-year-olds say okay to older women who worry too much. At 2:40, Lena's phone buzzed with a message from the pharmacy portal. The prior authorization for Theo's insulin had been denied pending additional documentation from a prescribing physician they had not seen in 14 months because seeing him cost $190. She read it 3 times. She put the phone face down on the prep table. She went into the walk-in cooler and stood in there for about 19 seconds with her hand over her mouth, and she did not cry because crying meant her eyes would be red for the next 8 hours, and someone would ask, and she did not have the energy to construct a lie that would hold. She came out. She poured Hollis a refill he had not asked for. She asked Neva about her granddaughter. She dropped a ticket and ran food and wiped down 2 tables, and she was pleasant, and she was funny, and every single person in that building would have told you she seemed fine. That is the part that gets left out of stories like this one, not the violence. The 8 hours of ordinary competence that come before the violence, performed by a woman doing arithmetic in her head about a child's medication while she smiles at a stranger and asks how the pie is. At 3:35, the dish pit backed up, and the bag by the back door was overflowing, and Kaylee moved toward it, and Lena told her to leave it and took it herself because she had a rule about that girl in the parking lot, and she had never once broken it. She pushed the back door open with her hip and propped it with the brick the way everybody did because the door locked behind you if you let it swing, and then you had to walk all the way around the building. She saw the box truck immediately. It was parked wrong nose out back end toward the fence engine running with nobody in the cab. The rear roll door was up about 8 inches. That was the detail that stopped her because a running truck with an open door at 3 in the morning is a truck. Somebody is loading and there was nobody loading it. She stood there with a garbage bag in her hand for 4 or 5 seconds. Then she saw the face. It was low near the gap, angled sideways to get an eye to the opening. A girl, 19, maybe 20. She did not shout. She did not bang on anything. She looked directly at Lena and she mouthed one word twice in Spanish, the word for help, and she did it slowly and carefully the way you do when you are trying to be understood through a small space by someone you have 3 seconds to reach. Lena's whole body went cold from the scalp down. She understood in that moment completely and without any reasoning at all that the girl was not asking to be let out. The girl was asking to be seen. There is a difference between those two things, and Lena would spend the next year trying to explain that difference to people who had never had to learn it. She took one step forward. That was when the hand closed on her arm. The fingers went in above the elbow, thumb dug into the soft part, and she was already being turned before she registered that she was being touched at all. Her feet did the thing feet do, which is try to keep up with a body that is already moving without permission. The garbage bag hit the ground and split. The voice was right at her ear, and it was almost bored, which was the worst part, and it told her to move faster, and it called her the word. The roll door came down behind her. She heard it, metal on metal, and then the latch. She was walked 22 feet back through that propped door into the light, and the smell of coffee and grease, and the sound of the ticket printer, and sat on her feet next to the mop sink like a chair being put back where it belonged. 9 people were sitting in that dining room. Hollis Teague heard a woman's shoes scrape on concrete and looked up from his pie. Neva Okonjo looked toward the kitchen doorway with her pen still in her hand. Bo Ferris turned from the flat top with a spatula in his fist and every muscle in his forearm standing out and did not take one step because he had a rule and because at that exact second the rule was the only thing standing between him and Springer. Charlene Dowd was in the office doorway. Kaylee Shore was carrying a water pitcher and stopped walking. And in booth 6, a man who had not touched his coffee in 20 minutes set both hands flat on the table, and under that table without a sound, a dog with a torn ear lifted her head off her paws and put her eyes on the back door. The man who had walked her in did not let go right away. He held her there, next to the mop sink, for another second and a half after her feet stopped moving, and that second and a half was the whole message. It said he could hold her as long as he wanted and put her down whenever he decided to. Then he opened his hand and stepped back and wiped his palm on the side of his jeans, and Lena felt that gesture land somewhere under her ribs and stay there. His name was Rusty Cade. She did not know it yet. What she knew was that he was maybe 30, built thick through the shoulders, and that he was not drunk, which she had been counting on, and which turned out not to be true. Behind him, a second man came through the door, laughing with his phone already up. Deuce Pruitt narrated it for whoever was on the other end of that recording, and he narrated it in the bright chirping voice of a man performing for people who were not in the room. He said the night shift out here was wild. He said the help had gotten lost in the trash. Lena heard her own voice come out steady and was surprised by it. She told them they were not allowed back here. Deuce laughed harder. Rusty said she was the one who had been someplace she was not allowed. And then the third one came in, and the temperature of the entire building changed, and nobody in it understood that except one man in a booth. Silas Rand was younger than the other two and dressed better than anyone in that county had reason to dress at 4 in the morning. He came in without hurrying. He took in the kitchen doorway, Bo at the flat top with the spatula, Charlene frozen in the office door, Kaylee holding a water pitcher, and Lena standing there rubbing her arm without realizing she was doing it. He apologized. That was the thing that Lena would try to explain to investigators later and would never quite get across. He apologized, and it was a good apology, better than most people manage. He said his associate had overreacted and that they had a driver sleeping in that box truck who had already been robbed twice this year, and that when they saw somebody standing at the back of it, they had assumed the worst, and he was sorry, and he understood if she wanted to call somebody about it. He put a $100 bill on the stainless steel counter next to her hip. He did not push it toward her. He set it down and took his hand off it, which is a very specific move, and it works on almost everybody because it turns the money into something that is already yours that you would have to actively refuse. Lena did not touch it. Silas smiled like she had done something interesting. He asked her name. She did not answer. He said Charlene had told him her name was Lena, and Charlene from the office doorway made a small sound like a woman stepping on something in the dark. He asked whether she was the one with the brother. The floor went out from under her. He said it pleasantly. He said somebody had mentioned she had a kid brother she looked after, that it was a hell of a thing for a young woman to take on, that his cousin had done the same for 2 nephews and it had eaten a decade of her life. He said it with real warmth. He asked how old the boy was. She said 16 and immediately hated herself for answering. He said 16 was a rough age. He said something about how 16-year-olds cost money, and then he said a thing that took 11 seconds to fully arrive in her body. He asked which pharmacy filled the boy's prescriptions because the chain one out on the state road was the worst in 3 counties, and he could get her into a better one. Lena did not remember telling anyone in that diner that Thea was diabetic. She had not told Charlene. She had told Bo once 2 years ago because Bo kept juicing the walk-in, and she had wanted him to know why. She had never mentioned it on the floor. Not once. She looked at Silas Rand and understood that this was not a man making conversation. This was a man showing her a file. Behind her, Bo Ferris put the spatula down on the flat top and left it there. Silas glanced at him, registered the size of him, registered something else about him too, and moved on without any change in his expression at all. Then he told Lena to have a good night and told Rusty they were leaving, and the 3 of them walked out through the dining room past 9 people who all found something interesting on their plates. Except Hollis Teague, who watched them the whole way, and Neva Okonjo, whose pen had not moved in 4 minutes, and a man in booth 6 who did not look up at all, which Lena noticed and which stung more than she expected. The bell over the door rang, then nothing. Kaylee started crying first, which broke something open, and Lena crossed the floor and put her arms around a 19-year-old and said, "The thing you say, that it was over, that it was fine." And she said it while her own hands were shaking so hard she had to press them flat against the girl's back to hide it. Charlene came out of the office and asked in the customer voice whether everybody was okay. Lena told her to call the sheriff. Charlene said she would and did not move. Lena said it again. Charlene said she needed to think about how to word it, and that was the first moment Lena understood that she was not going to be helped, and it landed harder than the hand on her arm had. She called it in herself from the payphone number on the wall because her cell was in her locker, and she said the words as flatly as she could, and the dispatcher asked twice whether anybody was injured, and Lena said no and heard how that sounded. Deputy Reese Brody arrived at 4:26. He took 11 minutes to get there from a substation 9 minutes away, and when he walked in, he did not go to Lena first. He went to Charlene. They talked for a minute and a half by the register before anybody asked Lena a single question, and Lena stood there watching two people decide the shape of what had happened to her. When Brody finally came over, he was polite. He wrote things down. He asked her to describe the grab, and she described it, and he asked whether she had been struck, and she said no, and he wrote that down and underlined it, and she watched him underline it. He went out to the lot. The box truck was gone. He came back and told her that without a plate and without the vehicle present, there was not a lot to work with, that he could take a report for the record, and that if she wanted to pursue it as an assault, she certainly could, but he wanted her to understand that a grip on the arm with no marks and no injury was realistically a citation at best, and that would be assuming they could identify the individual. Lena said she could identify the individual. She said she would recognize his voice for the rest of her life. Brody said he understood. Then he said, and he said it kindly, that Halloran ran a lot of freight through here and that most of their guys were fine, and that things got heated at 4 in the morning sometimes, and that he would talk to their operations manager and get it squared away. Lena asked him how he knew they were Halloran's people. Brody stopped writing. He said one of them had a company jacket on. None of them had been wearing a jacket. Lena had been close enough to smell the cologne on the third one. She said nothing, and she felt her face do nothing, and she thanked him, and she watched him leave, and she went into the walk-in cooler and stood there and understood exactly how alone she was. That was when the door opened behind her, and it was not Bo. It was the man from booth 6. He did not come in. He stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame, and he said her name was on her name tag, and his name was Corrigan. And then he asked her one question, and it was not, "Are you all right?" He asked her whether she had seen the inside of the truck. She said she had seen a face. He asked whether the face had made noise. She said no. He was quiet for a second, and then he said that mattered, and that it mattered in a way she was not going to like. She asked what he meant. Ain said, people who are locked in something bang on the walls. People who have already learned what happens when they bang on the walls do not. He said it flat without any drama in it at all, and it went through her like ice water. He asked him who he was. He said he was a guy passing through, and that was true, and it was also the least true thing anybody said to her that entire year. Then he told her that the deputy had lied to her about the jacket, that he had seen the whole exchange from 20 feet away, and that she should not report anything else to that particular officer, and that she should write down everything she remembered tonight before she slept, because memory reorganizes itself in the first 12 hours, and defense attorneys know exactly how to take that apart. She asked him how he knew that. He said he had watched it happen to somebody once. He did not explain, and he stepped back, and he was gone before she could ask anything else. And Lena stood in a walk in a cooler at 4:40 in the morning and realized her hands had stopped shaking and did not know whether that was relief or something worse. She worked the rest of the shift. She got home at 7:15, and Theo was already up, and he looked at her face for 2 seconds and asked what happened. And she said nothing happened, and he said okay, and neither of them believed the other one. And that was the moment she decided to lie to her own brother, and she would think about it later, more than she thought about almost anything else. She counted the insulin pens again while he was in the shower. Still 2. Still lasting too long. She slept 4 hours and woke to 7 missed calls from a number she did not know. The 8th call came at noon, and she answered it. It was a woman from Human Resources at Halloran Freight, and she was warm, and she was apologetic. And she said Mr. Halloran had been made aware of an incident at the truck stop overnight and was extremely upset about it. She said the individuals involved were contract drivers, and their status was under review. She said Halloran Freight took this seriously. And then, without any transition at all, she said that they had an opening in dispatch, $26 an hour, Monday through Friday, 7 to 3. Full medical, dental, and vision after a 30-day waiting period, and she said the phrase full medical twice, and the second time she slowed down on it. Lena sat on the edge of her bed with the phone against her ear, and did the math she had promised herself she would never do again. 26 an hour was not a raise. 26 an hour was a different life. It was a bedroom door that closed properly. It was a car that started on flat ground. It was a boy who took the full dose because the full dose cost $35 a month with a card in your wallet instead of $400 without one. She heard herself say she would think about it. The woman said, "Take all the time you need," and gave her a direct line and hung up, and Lena sat there for a long time and understood with absolute clarity that she had just been offered 130,000 reasons to forget a girl's face in a gap in a door. She did not tell anybody about the call. Not Bo, not Kaylee, not Corrigan. She carried the paperwork in her bag for 3 days and took it out and looked at it in the parking lot before every shift. And each time she put it back, and each time it got a little harder to put back. And that is the honest thing that most stories leave out. She was not brave for 3 days. She was undecided for 3 days. On Saturday, Kaylee did not come in. She did not call. Charlene left 2 messages and then said the word that managers say about 19-year-olds, that she had probably flaked. And Lena stood in the middle of the floor with a coffee pot in her hand and felt something drop through her. She drove to the address on the girl's application at 2 in the afternoon after her shift on 4 hours of sleep and knocked, and a woman answered who turned out to be Kaylee's aunt and who said Kaylee was asleep and Lena said she needed to see her, and the aunt said she was sick and Lena said she was not leaving. Kaylee came to the door with the phone number receipt still in her hand. She had called it. She had called it on Thursday hours before Lena took the trash out because 18 an hour with room and board was more money than she had ever been offered. And because she had $1,100 in credit card debt from a semester she did not finish. A man had picked up, very polite. He had asked her about her family first. He had told her a van came through on Thursdays. Kaylee had gotten as far as packing a duffel bag before she got scared, for a reason she could not name, and stayed home instead. Lena asked her what made her scared. Kaylee said the man had asked whether anybody would notice if she started on Thursday instead of Monday. Lena drove back to her apartment and sat in her car in the lot for 11 minutes without turning off the engine. And then she took the Halloran paperwork out of her bag and tore it into pieces small enough that she could not have taped it back together if she changed her mind at 2 in the morning, which she was fairly sure she would. Then she called the number on the receipt herself. It rang 4 times. A man answered. She said she had heard about the hostess position. I was warm. He was unhurried. He asked her name and she gave a false one, and he asked whether she was local, and she said yes, and he asked whether her people were local too. And she recognized the voice. It was the third man, the one who had set $100 down and taken his hand off it, the one who knew about her brother. She hung up so fast she dropped the phone into the footwell. That night, she went in early and found Neva Okonjo at the counter and sat down across from her and asked her about the wrecker. Neva said, "What about it?" Lena asked how far back the dash cam kept footage. Neva put down her pen and looked at her over her glasses for a long moment, and something passed between 2 women who had known each other for 6 years without ever once discussing anything that mattered. Neva said the card held about 90 days before it started writing over itself. Lena asked if the truck is on it. Neva said the truck was on all of it. Then she said the thing that changed everything, and she said it slowly because she was working it out as she said it, and Lena watched a 68-year-old woman's face come apart in real time. She said every Thursday for months, and it always parked in the fire lane, and it always sat about 40 minutes, and here was the part that had bothered her without ever quite surfacing, that it always came in heavy on the rear springs, and it always left heavy. It never unloaded anything. Lena said nothing. Neva said that had never once occurred to her before this exact second, and that she had been looking at it out that window since February. At 2 in the morning, the bell over the door rang, and Rusty Cade walked in with Deuce Pruitt behind him, and they took the booth in the dead center of the dining room, the one with the most tables around it, and Lena understood that they had not picked it because it was comfortable. Rusty looked straight at her and snapped his fingers twice and told her they were ready to order. And Bo Ferris, who had not touched another human being in 11 years, reached under the counter and quietly turned on the tape recorder Corrigan had left in the kitchen that morning without telling anyone why. Ada Grange stayed in New Mexico for 9 days. Her mother had booked 2 nights at the motel on the state road and ended up paying for a week and a half because on the 3rd morning the girl came out to the parking lot with the bong and said she was not leaving until the trial part was over. And Priya Grange, who had spent 4 years learning what it cost to argue with Ada Grange, did not argue. That was how an 11-year-old ended up sitting in the second row of a federal courthouse in Las Cruces with a Malinois asleep on her feet. The case moved faster than anybody expected, and the reason it moved fast had nothing to do with heroism. It moved fast because of paper. Russell Cade went first, and he went the way men like that always go, which is loudly and then not at all. He kept the $3.4 million suit alive for exactly 11 days after the animal hearing, until his own attorney watched 41 minutes of video in a conference room and withdrew from representation the same afternoon. The suit was dismissed with prejudice. Cade was indicted 8 days later on federal counts of forced labor and conspiracy, and he sat in a holding cell for 4 months, telling anyone who would listen that he had been hired to drive. He got 14 years. Deuce Pruitt gave them everything. He gave it in a room in Albuquerque over 9 hours, crying most of the way through. And the reason he was able to give them so much was the same reason he had been useless as a criminal, which was that he had filmed all of it. 2 years of it. Housing sites, transfer lots, work crews, a man being taken off a bus, his own voice narrating over the top of it, in that bright chirping tone, performing for people who were not in the room. The government did not have to prove Deuce Pruitt was there. Deuce Pruitt had already proved it over and over for the entertainment of about 200 followers. He got 6 years, and he thanked the judge, and nobody in that courtroom knew what to do with that. Silas Rand took the longest and hurt the most. I was arrested in a rental car outside Lubbock 19 days after the highway stop, and he did not resist, and he did not say anything to the agents beyond confirming his name. And for 3 months, it looked like the case against him was thin because Silas Rand had never once put his hand on anybody in his life. He had never driven a truck. He had never worked a housing site. He had never been on a single frame of Deuce Pruitt's footage. What he had was a spreadsheet. He had built it himself over 4 years on a laptop in his own apartment because he was the one who ran the money, and he could not run the money without knowing the numbers. Names, arrival dates, hours worked, deductions for housing deductions, for transport deductions, for a document fee that appeared on every line and never went down. Balances that grew every single month a person worked. 31 names. One of them was marked closed in a column with no explanation, and when the analyst chased it, it turned out to belong to a man named Efrain Duarte, who had fallen from a grain elevator ladder in a neighboring county 2 years earlier and had been buried under a county headstone that said unidentified male because nobody had come forward to claim him and nobody had reported him missing because on paper he had never been hired by anyone at all. Efrain Duarte had a mother in Oaxaca who had been calling a phone number that stopped working in March of that year. She got a name back on a stone 26 months later, and she got it because a very careful young man had kept a very good spreadsheet. That was the sentence the prosecutor used in closing, and Lena in the third row heard it and thought about $100 bill set down on a counter and a hand coming off it. Silas Rand got 22 years. Vernon Halloran was never charged with anything. That was the part Lena could not swallow for a long time, and she said so publicly more than once. He was not indicted. He was not arrested. He hired a firm out of Dallas and gave one sworn deposition that ran 7 hours. And in it, he said the words, "I was not aware," 41 separate times. And a court reporter counted them, and that count made it into a newspaper. But he lost his operating authority for 90 days pending a federal safety and compliance review, and 90 days is a death sentence in freight. He lost the food distribution contract in April. He lost the 2 agricultural contracts in May, and the second one came with a public statement from a company that had never made a public statement about anything. His name came off the building in June, replaced by a holding company acronym, and his son moved the office to Texas. And Lena Cortez learned the thing that she would spend the rest of her life repeating to people, which was that power, like, that does not lose arguments. It loses its privacy. Nobody ever wins the argument with a man like Vernon Halloran. What you can do is make it impossible for him to keep operating quietly, and quiet is the entire business model. Deputy Reese Brody was decertified in August, not for corruption, because they could never prove the payments were anything other than legal off-duty security work. He was decertified for the report he wrote on the night of the first grab, in which he had recorded a statement Lena Cortez never made and had written down a detail about a company jacket that appeared on no video, no photograph, and no other witness account. He lost his certification for 11 words. Charlene Dowd came in on a Sunday morning when it was slow about a month after the sentencing and stood in front of Lena with her hands at her sides. She said she had told the deputy she was in the office. Lena said she knew. Charlene said she was in the doorway. Lena said she knew that too. Charlene said she had told herself for 6 weeks that it was about 11 jobs and that it was not about 11 jobs. It was about hers. She said she had been 47 years old with a car payment and a mother in assisted living, and that she had done the math in about 2 seconds and had hated herself every day since. Lena let it sit. She was not going to make it easy, and pretending it was easy would have been a lie. Then she told Charlene that saying it out loud was more than almost anybody ever does. Charlene asked if that was it. Lena said that was a lot. Charlene transferred to a location in Deming in the fall and left the company entirely the following year. And she sent Lena a card at Christmas for 6 years running, and Lena kept every one of them and never wrote back. And both of those things were true at the same time. Bo Ferris was made manager in September. The first thing he did was put a sign by the register that said staff may refuse service to anyone. No explanation required, no approval required. The second thing he did was give Lena a raise she had not asked for and would not discuss. The third thing he did took him 4 months, which was to sit down with a lawyer from a workers' rights clinic and give a full statement about a fire axe and a jammed latch and exactly how far he had stayed from every human being in that parking lot, and to be told at the end of it that no one was ever going to charge him with anything. He walked out to his truck and sat in it for a while. 11 years he had carried that cage. He had built an entire self around a rule, and then one night he had picked up an axe anyway, and the world had not ended. Hollis Teague was the one who changed the most, and he was the one nobody expected. I was 76, and he had spent 5 years believing that his usefulness had ended the day his lungs did, and then he had keyed a microphone at 4 in the morning and 11 trucks had answered him. He would not shut up about it after that, and thank God, because what came out of it was the only part of this whole story that outlived the trial. He started talking on Channel 19 about what a truck stop actually is at 3 in the morning, which is the only lit place for 60 miles where a stranger can walk in and stand under a light. He started asking drivers to look at the corners of the lot on their way in. He kept saying one line until other people started saying it back to him, which was that the loading never happens where the people are. A dispatcher in Oklahoma printed the first decals. Yellow about the size of a hand, meaning nothing to anybody who did not know, and meaning one specific thing to anybody who did, which was that the door was unlocked, the phone was free, and nobody inside was going to ask for paperwork. 14 months later, there were 460 of them across 9 states. Hollis lived to see 200 of them and died in his sleep in the spring, and the funeral procession out of Vaughan Flats was 31 trucks long, and none of them were carrying anything. Jimena Ocaña testified for 2 hours and 11 minutes. She was 19, and she had been in that country for 11 months, and she had a document in her hand that said she could stay while the case proceeded, and she had insisted on doing it in English badly on purpose because she said she wanted the jury to hear her try. At the end, the defense asked her why she had not run in 7 months. She said she had run once in her second week. She said a man in a car with lights on the roof had picked her up on the county road and had been very kind and had given her water and had driven her back. The jury was out for 4 hours. Lena Cortez did not go back to serving tables. She took a job in the fall with a victim services office, 2 counties over front desk, first, then intake, then a title with the word coordinator in it, and she was terrible at the paperwork and extraordinary at the part where somebody comes through a door and cannot make themselves sit down. She had a specific talent nobody could teach, which was that she never stood over anybody. She always sat. Theo went back on his full dose in October. He got the pump in February. He also got, without anybody planning it, a very strange education for a 16-year-old, which was watching his sister turn down $180,000 in a house in his own medication at a lunch counter in front of 9 people. He asked her about it exactly once that spring in the car. He asked whether she ever thought about the money. She said every single day. He asked if she regretted it. She said no, and then she said the honest part, which was that she did not regret it, and it still cost her something, and both of those were true, and that anybody who tells you doing the right thing feels good is selling you something. Theo is 23 now. He works in emergency medical services. He has never once told this story at a party. and Nathaniel Corrigan stayed in Vaughan Flats for 11 months. He had not intended to. He had intended to hand off a dog and drive home. But there was a trial and then a second trial and then a civil deposition, and then a woman from the workers' rights clinic asked him if he would sit with witnesses who were afraid of uniformed people. And it turned out he was good at that because he did not talk much and he never stood over anybody either. He and Priya Grange talked on the phone almost every week for a year, and then less, and then more again. And that is as far as this story is going to go into it because it was theirs. The thing everybody wants to know is what happened to the dog. Here's what happened to the dog. Corrigan drove to Bandera in October on the correct date, 6 months late, by his own accounting and not late at all by anybody else's. And he stood in Priya Grange's kitchen with the leash in his hand and gave a small speech he had been working on for 400 and some days. Ada let him get about 9 words in. She said her dad had told her that Vesper picks and that you do not tell her, you ask her. Corrigan said that was not really how it worked. Ada said it was how her dad said it worked. So he took the leash off in a kitchen with 2 women watching him. The dog walked to Ada. She put her head under the girl's hand and stayed there for a long moment, and Ada put her face down into the top of that dog's skull, the way her father used to. Then Vesper turned around and walked back and sat down on Corrigan's foot. Ada Grange, 11 years old, wiped her face with the back of her wrist and said okay in the voice of somebody who has just been told something she already knew. And then she made him promise to bring the dog to Texas twice a year, and he has never missed one. The Ocotillo Diner is still open. It is still open 24 hours, and the yellow decal is on the front glass at eye level, and the sign by the register still says, staff may refuse service to anyone. Lena stops there a few times a month. Sometimes she does not notice any of it. Sometimes she stands in the lot for a second before she goes in. And the thing she thinks about is not the hand on her arm, and it is not the inside of that truck, and it is not the $180,000. She thinks about 9 people. 9 decent people with kids and tros and car payment, people who would tell you without hesitating that they would never sit still while something like that happened in front of them, sat in a diner in New Mexico, and heard a woman get dragged past a propped door and did nothing. They did nothing for one reason only. Nobody had gone first. Then a 76-year-old man with an oxygen tank, keyed a microphone, and 11 trucks he had never met answered him. A 68-year-old woman handed over a memory card she had almost thrown away. A convicted felon picked up an axe knowing exactly what it could cost him. A 19-year-old with torn hands went back to work. A frightened manager stood up at a counter and said nothing at all, and it still counted. And a woman who had $61 in the bank turned around in a parking lot and went back for somebody else's kid. That is what one person is worth. Not because any of them were heroes, because somebody went first and it turned out that going first is the only thing that has ever worked. They looked at Lena Cortez and saw the easiest person in that building to move. They were wrong and it cost them everything, and she was the only one in that room who could not be moved at all.